Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. I hope you're a little past your tryptophan hangover this Thanksgiving weekend and are ready for the busy shopping short season that, because of the late date of Thanksgiving, has left us a frantic pace towards Christmas. Yes, we say Christmas on this program. Our first guest this week is the president of the Family Foundation, Victoria Cobb. Victoria, first and foremost, happy Thanksgiving, and I hope you had a wonderful holiday.
Happy Thanksgiving to you, and yes, it's fantastic to be with family and celebrate the things that we've been blessed with, so thanks for having me on the show today.
Not at all, not at all. Now, I remember there was one of those revolutionaries a couple of hundred years ago said that this Constitution was completely adequate to govern a moral and God-fearing nation. I think Adams was his name, not the one that ran for Attorney General, his great-great-great-great-grandcousin. But I've been looking at some of the pre-filed bills for January's newly minted Democrat majority, and they really have issue with some morals things going on here. I mean, it's gambling and it's sexual orientation and women. And what is it with these guys and sex and gambling?
Well, it is funny because for years and years, the media used to harp on Republicans for doing all social legislation, which wasn't true, in fact. They did many, many substantive things on transportation, education, healthcare. But now we have a new shift in power, and what's interesting is all of the opening bills. I was waiting for the first bill to actually be dropped that impacts either education, transportation, or health, because so many of them are absolutely what you speak of. They are, how do we gamble more? How do we create rights for people who change their sexuality and gender on some kind of a continuum fluid thing? I mean, it's a significant shift in what we're going to be focused on and what's going to happen here in the Commonwealth unless some great citizens rally to defend the things that we've always loved and held dear.
Well, I know that, let's go to the classic hit in the bunch, which is the Equal Rights Amendment, which isn't about equal rights, which, as I've argued plenty of times, but I'm apparently genetically not qualified. However, there are bills now that say I could identify as a woman, therefore I should be able to get equal rights in this if I self-identify. But
yes, I would definitely say that these days, and unfortunately under this definition of the ERA, anyone can be a woman. So the rights that were, in theory, supposed to be gaining through this are not actually
out the window
conferred upon women.
They come at you from so many directions that it almost seems comedic, but it's frightening. And the Equal Rights Amendment has never been ratified, and there is an argument to be made that it is past its shelf life, past its constitutional mandate, because the last time a state voted to ratify it, and where most of the ones leading up to it were decades ago, but they're waiting for that last one, and Virginia could be that last state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Talk about the dangers if we start making special classes, especially in light of today's environment where, special targeted groups of, identity politics seekers are going to become power bases.
Well, there's no question. You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, while the ERA seems like an innocuous concept, it's this vaguely worded Trojan horse to bring about wide-sweeping liberal policies at a U.S. constitutional level through, as you pointed out, a legally invalid process without true agreement by the populace. I mean, that it's kind of the left dream package that looks benign to the average voter. They strut around a poll in Virginia, 82% agree with it. Well, the poll was basically, do you like women? I mean, it was ridiculous. It had absolutely the poll that they did had no bearing on what the Equal Rights Act actually is and what the amendment's actually going to do. And, to your question, what is it actually going to do? The first thing that people need to understand about this is that unlike what they say, which is this is going to put women in the Constitution for the first time ever, you'll hear that sort of said, they realize, and everyone knows, if you actually read the words, it is not actually placing the word woman into the Constitution. It's simply saying that the government, quote unquote, basically is not going to, in any way harm rights by account of sex. And here's where the point you were just making comes in. At least in 1970 and 71, 72, when this first came on the radar, at least, or I should say when it first actually got introduced as a bill, at least at that point, society had a shared agreement that there were two sexes. There was male and there was female. We are not even in that place anymore. So when you put the word sex brand new into the U.S. Constitution, and our current society has grand confusion around what sex and gender are, you've inserted that confusion into the U.S. Constitution. And so what we would fully expect, is just in the same way that we've already had cases go to the U.S. Supreme Court trying to make the Civil Rights Act and such use the word sex to apply to sexual orientation and gender identity of all stripes. We would expect that this word would be interpreted to mean one of, I have no idea how many sexes there actually are in the minds of the left. And so it does create these categories. And when you then say they can't have rights abridged, all of a sudden our community conversations about things like public school shower rooms and bathrooms and field trips and those things that are happening in conversation in communities, policies that are being set to try to handle the privacy and bodily rights of girls, for example, and also be kind and considerate to people who are having gender dysphoria. Those things go from a community level, not even just to the state level, but all the way up to, because the second part of the Equal Rights Amendment is that we're going to turn over all the power to deal with these issues to Congress. And so it's a massive power grab by the federal government over these kind of very personalized, very localized issues that should be dealt with at the community level. And so it's a stunner on that front. And then there's a host of 100 other reasons why this thing is harmful, but you nailed that one.
Victoria Cobb is on with us. She's the president of the Family Foundation. Is it unfair for me to say that a government that fails 4 times out of 10 to accurately deliver my mail to me is ill-equipped to decide whether or not I am a male?
Well, and I think it is I think it is going to be shocking to people if the ERA were to ever, I would argue, illegally find its way into the U.S. Constitution and actually somehow become valid. If that were to ever happen, I think people will be stunned at the federal power grab aspect of it. They aren't thinking about, wow, all these issues that we debate at the state and local level are null and void. Those are now turned over to Congress. And that's not just these gender issues. That's also abortion law. And that has been obviously a very polarized, very divided issue here in Virginia. And that's an issue that we're deeply concerned about, the Equal Rights Amendment, when certain states have put that kind of language into their own state constitution. We've had courts say that all of a sudden that means that they are required to have legal abortion and, in fact, have it funded by the taxpayer. Well, even that conversation now goes into the U.S. Constitution. The power goes up to the federal government to look at abortion law. I mean, that's something that I just don't think, given the popularity of Congress and the effectiveness of government, as you point out, this is not something that I think people understand is what we're actually doing when we talk about the ERA.
Victoria, this was brought up to me several weeks ago in a conversation off air, but it was off to the side, that perhaps that which will end the ERA in the Virginia General Assembly is the idea that perhaps, if done correctly, fathers' rights could become, since the bill says, the amendment says you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender, if a father can then say, no, I don't want this abortion to happen, and if they are opening a Pandora's box that they may not realize that might actually backfire on them and create a father's rights movement that we haven't seen before.
That would be a very interesting outcome of the Equal Rights Amendment because I think the problem is, and everyone knows it, the wording is so vague. And I mean, we just need to simply laugh at the fact that the quote unquote progressive movement is digging something up that is really worded and conceptualized back in the 70s. And in the 70s, I would argue that society was struggling with sort of how do we treat men and women equal and yet recognize their differences. And in the 70s, they thought equality meant sameness. It really was sort of this, okay, we don't really know how to grapple with the fact that, women are, want to be in the workplace, want to, have the same wages and those kind of things, but yet they get pregnant and they take leave. And, there was a genuine struggle over how to make this happen. But we are now we're about to crest into 2020. And in the world we now live in, our society actually has come a very long way in not simply saying that women and men are equal, but actually accounting for the places where we are equal but different in the fact, for example, that women have pregnancy and have children. And in fact, we've dealt with things like how do we handle breastfeeding in the workplace? I mean, there are some really tricky issues, and they are ways in which we are different from another. And the ERA sets us backwards. It actually sort of reverses all of those gains and says, no, we're not just equal. We have to be the same, and not just men and women, men, women. And, I actually met James, who was the first non-binary person given a official status of this on his license out in Oregon. And I will tell you, there's a really tragic life story of how harmful this sort of ideology has been, and he has come full circle to his biological sex, which is male. But I will tell you, the harm of all of this in that individual's life, and to think about non-binary is now something that will be considered a sex and will have equal rights in our Constitution under the ERA if it were to pass. Now, we do have to, you mentioned this, and I just always want to keep in this conversation the concept of this legally non-valid thing, because just for an audience that might not understand the details, this was put forward, given a deadline, so introduced in 70, finally passed the Senate in 72, given a deadline of 79, and then extended to 82. And there were 35 states that had passed it between 72 and 79, but 5 during that time basically rescinded. Yeah. So it really was back down to 30. They were given 3 more years, no more states came on, and then it sat dormant, I would argue, at 30 states for decades, and was brought back just simply 2 years ago in 2017, and 2 more states came on board. So in the liberal crazy math, the states that rescinded don't count, the deadline doesn't count, and somehow, if Virginia passes this, we're going to be the 38th. I would argue there's a deadline, and states rescinded, so we're nowhere near state number 38. And so all we're really doing, if Virginia passes this, is tossing this into tremendous litigation that will go to the higher echelons of the Supreme Court ultimately. But it's wasted time because it's just an absurd concept that we would somehow be the 38th state. But boy, they've convinced a lot of folks with their signs and their ratified 38 and all of that.
Well, let me ask you this, though, economically, and I'm trying to find the data on what our number one industry was in the early 70s, but I've got to think it was something along the lines of steel, shipping, automotive manufacturing. It was much more of an industrial place than our technological country is in 2019 now. And those companies like Google and Amazon are so far removed from the world where the Equal Rights Amendment was first written, I think feeds to what you're saying. Is there are a lot of places saying, yeah, we're done. We don't need that anymore because our employers are now under their own marketplaces doing a better job of treating people fairly and equitably.
There's no question. If you want to be a Fortune 500, you want to be a company on the map recruiting well, you're going to have to treat men and women equally, but also actually account for their gender differences, meaning you're going to have to, embrace women in all of the motherhood that comes with many of them. You can't simply say we're going to treat men and women equally. The reality is we have things like maternity leave, and now we have paternity leave, and some companies are getting smart enough to even have, adoption leave. And we're entering a world where we're understanding what it takes to compete in the marketplace. But more than that, and I would say, I guess I should say in addition to that, because I think the free market is the first point where we want this to happen, but government has taken steps. In Virginia, we have it in our state law. It's all over federal laws. We have every kind of sort of place where there were differences really has been addressed, whether it's pay gaps and so forth. And so when women encounter these things, the law should be more than sufficient for them to litigate and win these battles, because the laws are there. So simply adding one more layer doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the law is there. Now, I'm not saying it isn't ever the case that women experience inequality. I guarantee you they do. We all know stories. But experiencing it because the culture hasn't 100% in every corner gotten where it needs to be is different than saying, if you experience it, there's no remedy, that our laws are insufficient to help you stand up for your rights.
Victoria Cobb is on with us, president of the Family Foundation. First bills already filed for the General Assembly session. Philip Van Cleve of the Virginia Citizens Defense League is coming up next, so we're going to kind of put a pin in the Second Amendment issues. I want to go to something that tears apart more families than I can shake a stick at, and is one of the most classic cases of fraudulent politicking I've ever come across, which is the idea of legalized gambling.
Promoting an activity which is known to disproportionately harm those with the least means as the savior of an economically depressed area is dishonest, diluted, and dangerous. The negative effects of a casino, we're talking higher crime, addiction, sex trafficking, decreased home values, financial losses, and most importantly to us, broken families. They'll be felt broadly. And what's sad about the proposals particularly on the casino stuff that's coming towards Virginia, is that we're saying that just the exact city that will have the gambling, that will have the casino, will be able to vote. When I can assure you, the entire area around it, not simply that city. So, Bristol is one little, Bristol will vote whether they can have a casino, but all around them, every single county that touches them will be deeply impacted, and I don't mean in a positive way, but they have no voice in the proposals that have come to the General Assembly in the past. And so it's an alarming thing. Virginia at one point understood that these things needed to be, if we were going to embrace new forms of gambling, we did that as a state at the ballot box saying we're going to do that. That's how we added the lottery and so forth. But in this case, we're going to kind of bypass the overarching will of the people to go with the smallest subset of people that are told that this is going to economically help them. And it's truly tragic. And we're going to do everything we can to block this from coming to pass. It is a little bit of a bipartisan issue. There are Republicans that support it, and there are Democrats who oppose it. So we're going to try to work that angle and help really bring the facts to bear on the situation before we're too late.
But Virginia's already been doing this. Sociologists have pointed to the fact that the people who play scratch-off lottery tickets are engaging the same addictive behavior that slot machine gambling plays on.
Oh, the harm to local business for any kind of gambling is, any shop owner in these towns that are looking at casinos ought to be very concerned. And as you point out, this is the first year we got handed to us an incredibly disappointing vote. We got handed to us these slot machine places, through quote unquote historic horse simulcast.
Saving the horse racing, because getting on the back of horses.
If it were about actual horses, I'd at least give them the sentiment that there's an industry involved there. But what they did this time is basically create these slot machines that have almost no actual connection to even the sport of horse racing. There is the same thing as pulling a lever and getting lemons, oranges, and whatever it is that it is when you're in Vegas. And we've now got, these facilities, these Rosies popping up all over the place with these banks and banks of slot machines. And already, what's funny is it's already being noted that it's harming business around them. Ironically, the one that we've heard about is, and actually it's come out in the news, is one of the Rosies in the Metro Richmond area got placed right next to a strip club.
Great.
And the strip club owner has already seen the drop in revenue. And I laugh because I don't want either of those businesses, and I want them all gone.
Oh,
and so I'm not
gosh.
really sad for the strip club owner. But it does show instantly that people have a certain amount of disposable income, and the first thing they're going to do is switch it from places like shops and movies and things that are local, and then they're going to move it to the casinos. And then the second component is, after they get through that, once they become addicted, you get into what is not disposable income, which is food and housing, and
Sure.
and that's where real devastation begins to take place.
Well, and that's where it tears apart families. People start saying, well, what are you doing? I mean, and where did our rent go? And then there's homelessness on top of it, which we see in Atlantic City in spades. It's horrific. And it's expensive for the government. So everything the government says, oh, we're going to be printing money, so much tax revenue, is actually going to go out the door double what they're taking in once the social programs have to start being paid for.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep. It's and that's the thing. The government usually fails to account when they look at these studies and they think, oh, this is going to raise revenue for the area. They fail to account for the social service cost that's going to come straight back when the families are broken, when the homes, when they go bankrupt and they get evicted, and all of those components just typically are understated in any kind of gambling study. They just don't typically look at the full ramifications, and they find out when it's ultimately too late. And we're just hoping that we can stop that from happening here in Virginia. I mean, Indian tribe casinos are one thing, which are very difficult to stop because of their rights to the land. But it's a whole other thing when our Commonwealth, in addition to the Indian casinos, are looking at setting up casinos here in the Commonwealth.
It is a frightening time. What is the hope, as we finish this off, Victoria, that some Democrats will stand against their party bosses and perhaps not pass these things, and maybe the ability of a Todd Gilbert or a Rob Bell or a Mark Obenshain to negotiate some coalitions amongst people who are like, no, I don't want this in my neighborhood, even if it is my party that says we have to pass it?
Well, certainly I think gambling is something that's a little bit less party associated. It's typically that the casinos come in. I mean, I will tell you, they've bought up every lobbying firm here in Virginia. I mean, I've not found a single large lobbying shop, law firm, whatever, that does government affairs that doesn't have one gambling client. It's kind of a stunner. So these legislators are bombarded with, 40, 50 lobbyists, for the casinos, and getting funded into their campaigns by the casino industry. And so the tricky part is who's willing to stand against that more than even their party, which is what's interesting, and why Republicans have gotten roped in the past, and why there are still Democrats. There are some that do oppose it. So the hope is we can build out of that 51 to oppose it. Now, on the other issues, they're a lot harder. ERA and guns, they're a lot harder because they are so party defined. Mm-hmm. And you really have to have somebody willing to shake it up a little bit with their party, and that's going to be very, very challenging. I've talked with my friend who does my job in California, and I've asked him whatever stops anything crazy from passing, right? So, like, because I'm looking at our makeup of the Democrats who now hold power, and they're not just Democrats; they are far, far left-wing progressive. I mean, there's really not. I mean, gosh, when the papers start calling Dick Sassbaugh the moderate, maybe on business issues, but that's about it. I mean, it's a stunner who they're trying to say might be the more tempered of the social issues, and I just don't think there's anybody to stop it. And my friend in California said, well, you hope they don't know how to govern. You hope that they have infighting, which I know there is some of that in Virginia, particularly between the Black Caucus and the rest of the Democrat Party. And so, you try to pick off individuals for various votes wherever you can. You have to form new alliances with people that we're going to be working with people who probably hate everything we do 90% of the time, but maybe on one vote, we're going to try to work with them and peel them off. And that's what every conservative, freedom-loving group needs to do is just focus in on your principles, focus in on the alliances you do have, and then figure out where is there any kind of gap, and how do we, how do we bring somebody on board and build a bridge where we need to build a bridge.
Well, thank you so much for everything you do, Victoria, at familyfoundation.org. And thank you for, giving us hope that even if in California they have ways of doing it, if they can do it, we can do it here in Virginia. And I know you can. And thank you for taking us on this little tour of the coming General Assembly session. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Anytime. Thanks so much for having me.
As I mentioned, Philip Van Cleve, president of the Virginia Citizens Defense League, not just the Second Amendment bills that have already been pre-filed, but the Sanctuary County movement, coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.